Well, thank you everyone for joining us for what is the latest in the Millenol Insight series online. If you don't know Millenol as an organization, we are a family of brands and we design and manufacture product for places where people live, where they get healed, where they learn, and where they work. And a lot of our design is backed up by research, and we love to hear research from external organizations. And today, I'm pleased to say that we are joined by Gillian Burgess-Smith, who is from Strawberry Leopard. She's a chartered architect with over 30 years experience, and she thought she was an inclusive designer before she herself became neurodegenerative. I'm really looking forward to this session. And this session is, are you an inclusive designer? Gillian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my story. So firstly, for those who have a slight impairment, I'm going to describe myself. I'm a white female, 55 years old. I'm 5'8" tall, or 172 centimeters. I have mid-length dark hair and an olive complexion. I'm sitting in my study with plants around me. I'm wearing a turquoise hat, a black vest, and a sunflower lanyard for hidden disabilities. This was actually an initiative that was started at Gatwick in 2016. And it sort of just says, just be a little bit more patient with me, or I need more time. I know this is also in Toronto Airport as well. I don't know what other airports in the US, and some of you may have seen it. But essentially, we've introduced this scheme into organisations that also want to create a culture of inclusivity. And after the talk this morning, where someone actually heard about it for the first time, they went into their client office and they were really pleased to see the box on the desk in their client office. So my pronouns are she and her. I'm the founder of Strawberry Leopard Limited, which is a profit-for-purpose inclusive design consultancy. I actually chose the name Strawberry Leopard because strawberry leopards were documented for the first time in 2012, and they are a pure, unique leopard with different genetics. I'm a fellow of the International Forum of Inclusion Practitioners, a consultant with Systems with Experience, which is a collective of lived experience experts, or outliers, as we often refer to ourselves. We all come from different fields. So we have Naomi, who's an applied neuroscientist. But we also have various psychologists from UK universities, and also our work with Christ University in Bengaluru, India, if I say that wrong, where we brought together the architecture and psychology schools. We have Daniel, who is the systems and cognition lead, and reinforces collaboration with Centric Labs, and he's looking at creating neuroscience for cities. We have Shalini from India, who is the biophilic design lead, and she also works with our horticultural lead on the biophilia effect and how it can be used for ecotherapy, changing mood, and increasing cognitive and sensory well-being. I've also more recently become a consultant with Built for Marketing, and their focus is really on assisting clients adopt inclusive design strategies within their own business, marketing, research, and design development. As Mark mentioned, I'm a chartered architect in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and I often say to people, if I wasn't an architect, I'd be a psychologist, looking at people's relationships and behaviours in relation to environments. I consult across inclusive design, workplace strategy, organisational design, change and transformation. I actually went into architecture the long way around. I left school at 16 and my first job was with a local authority as a junior clerical trainee, and the job involved spending 3 to 6 months in various departments such as finance, housing and trading standards and the architects department. And when I saw the architectural technicians and the trainees on these beautiful drawing boards, I realised that's what I wanted to do, and I approached the chief architect. They actually said, you can't do that, you're a woman. And this was back in 1987. So I took myself off to evening class and did an ONC in building studies and became an architectural technician, and then a day release foundation course into women in building. And then I asked the chief architect again, and they made me an architectural assistant and sponsored my first BA on day release degree at Greenwich University. And I did day release all the way through, becoming an architect in 1998. My experience has been diverse, from Hindu temples to performing arts centres and Polynesian cafes in Hawaiian airports. And since 2000, so when actually I came back for 2 years in Toronto and Vancouver, I joined Pringle Brandon, and my experience has been mainly in interior architecture, change management, and strategy. The values I hold most dearly are compassion, caring, and curiosity. And I just want to tell you a little bit about my personal story. So in 2019, I had 2 strokes, one of which was in the office, and I was diagnosed with a rare incurable brain tumor. And it wasn't long before I was having a different experience in the built environment, living with a neurodegenerative condition. This also coincided with my father, who had a 5-year battle with motor neuron disease, passing away in 2021. But all that time we cared for him in his home. And my mother is actually bedbound. She's been bedbound for over 2 years and in the last stage of vascular dementia. So this experience of having to adapt a house for disabled living, such as where to put handrails, fixings for hoists, furniture positioning for 2 elderly people trying to communicate and both having hearing loss, really shifted my perspective, and I developed a passion for inclusive design. I began to understand that inclusive design is also around safety, independence, and dignity. It's not just about getting into a space and exiting safely, but it's also about being able to function and save energy. And this is personal, physical energy. I think of this often when I'm traveling up to London, because I have lack of mobility and movement in my left arm post the strokes and spondylosis. And often there are wide stairs going up to the train platforms, and they don't have handrails either side. So I find myself struggling holding on to the right-hand side with people coming down on the left. And it takes a lot of energy, and I've nearly fallen several times. And also thinking back to my dad, it's not just about turning circles on a drawing. Thinking about that whole journey, early on, my dad wanted to maintain his dignity and sleep upstairs. However, there wasn't enough room, even with putting in a stair lift, but at the top of the stairs, there wasn't enough room to transfer him back onto a wheelchair. So my husband literally had to lift him off the stair lift and onto a chair. And from day one of using a wheelchair, he couldn't get into the kitchen because the doorways, plug heights were impossible for him to reach. So I'm now consulting on accessible homes with the ageing in place, and with the pressure on the NHS, it's really important to think about future proofing. People are living longer and trying to make homes more inclusive. It's more than just code. It really just goes beyond code, not just providing a disabled unit, but providing an accessible unit. Consider if one of your friends or family becomes permanently or temporarily disabled and can't visit. More changes make a difference, such as ramps instead of steps. And ramps accommodate wheelchairs, but also buggies and luggage. Inclusive design makes it better for everybody. Providing homes that have longevity also aligns with sustainability in design, so planning ahead. Asking ourselves, what are the implications of X, Y, and Z if this happens? This is where the design canvas that I'm going to share towards the end of the presentation can help. What I've found is by understanding the outliers or individuals that are often not included in the design process, we're designing better for everyone. And I really urge designers and architects listening to look at the new RIBA Inclusive Design Overlay. We can share that with everyone internationally. It just talks about getting an inclusive consultant from the beginning of the project. Now, as my perspective shifted, I want to learn about designing for people with invisible disabilities as well as physical disabilities. And previously, it had been more of a tick box type exercise. And the more I've studied around diversity, equality, and inclusion, access to work, the Equality Act, so we used to have like the ADA and the DDA, and here it's taken over by the Equality Act in 2010. So protected characteristics came more to the forefront. the more I realize if we understand the barriers to inclusion for individuals considered neurodivergent or not the norm, the more design and environments become reflective of today's completely diverse and complex society. So in 2020, I started research in the form of one-to-one interviews with individuals that are diagnosed or identified with neurodiversity, and creativity is part of their role or function. I'm also just going to explain in advance that I have speak notes as I suffer from aphasia. So aphasia is caused by strokes and damage to the brain that can affect speech and general communication, and that transfer between your brain and your mouth. As Mark mentioned, if you do have questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but I do take time to sort of formulate my thoughts. My whole journey continues to be humbling and enlightening. So next slide, please. So fact, no two people have the same brain, not even twins. Everyone's brain is wired differently. And just to explain neurodiversity, so neurodiversity is a term coined by Judy Singer in Australia in the 1990s, and it describes a new understanding of human neurocognitive capabilities that embraces differences. It is a social movement. Neurodiversity simply means neuro, brain, and diversity, different, brain different, as opposed to neurotypical, brain typical. Neurodiversity is a term used to describe the variation in neurocognitive profiles across the whole population. It's not about one condition, difficulty, or difference. The term recognizes the variety in the way we speak, we think, we move, we act, and communicate, that human brains are diverse and vary. Each one of us has a unique set of different connections with our billions of nerve cells. Therefore, the way we interact with our environment will vary from person to person. It's dynamic, change over time, as for me. For example, due to an incident or a brain injury or age-related condition, or just getting older, or a change in mental wellness. Neurological profiles can sometimes be collectively grouped as neurotypical, neurodivergent, and typical examples of this include autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, or neurodegenerative, which is where sensory processing differences develop over time, typically through age-related conditions such as dementia or Parkinson's. However, many people have not had their neurological profile formally assessed or do not fall tidily into one group, such as individuals with sensory processing sensitivities or traits, or highly sensitive person HSCP condition. There is a wide variety of spectrum of how everyone is affected. And this reminded me actually of a couple of quotes. So Dr. Stephen Shaw once said, when you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Autism is very diverse. Autism is a lifelong developmental order, affects an individual's perception of the world and their interaction with others and the environment, internally and externally. There is also another quote that says, we're all different, don't judge, understand instead. Even neurotypical people can be regularly or intermittently affected by some elements of the built environment for seemingly unconnected reasons to neurology. For example, sensory stimulation, so such as audible or visual noise. You know, we've all gone into that noisy bar and it's caused a headache or triggered dizziness or other form of discomfort or anxiety. It's also really important to remember that not all disabilities are permanent. Some are intermittent and others temporary. So for this reason, if we design for people with different abilities, we are creating more inclusive designs and environments for everyone. I remember when I was doing projects and in design, you sort of typically you'd speak to the project team and the senior leaders and the steering committees, and you take the brief here. Since I've been doing this research and reaching out, and with the group of outliers, I've actually been listening to people on sort of this end of the spectrum, and by understanding their needs, you are making the spaces more inclusive for everyone. And what's been really humbling over the last 3 years is that people have told me their stories, their experiences, and shared their feelings. In many ways, autism can impact an individual, but it does not define him or her. We should not judge them based on their diagnosis, and instead interact with them and try to accept and understand them as different individuals. Many neurodiverse people with autism and dyslexia have extraordinary skills, as we're learning with a lot of organisations now that are going out to actually employ people that are neurodivergent or neurodegenerative. And these skills can include pattern recognition, memory, maths, diversity of thought, creativity and innovation, lateral thinking, strategic analysis. They all bring a different perspective to have different people's viewpoint in the room. Also, consistency and accuracy of tasks once mastered. Often they struggle. This can be with recruitment process, disclosure of the environment, processes, and culture. So this is partly why I started the research in the form of the one-to-one interviews with individuals that are diagnosed or identified with neurodiversity. And the context for the research was to listen to people and understand how they adapted their creative work processes during the pandemic and as we move forward, and to create a better understanding across remote and in-person work environments of what contributes to creative effectiveness. Now, one of the similarities that came across with the research was that most individuals described sensory processing differences. And when I'm discussing sensory processing differences, I'm talking about 9 senses. There are many more than 9 senses, but there are definitely more than 5, and typically the 1 or 2 that I may have designed for previously. So the 9 senses are vision, proprioception, so body awareness, hearing, smell, interoception, that internal sense, such as when your heart beats faster, touch, taste, vestibular sense of movement and balance, and thermoception or temperature sense. And we're hearing a lot more about that now with sort of the menopause and people talking there around sort of their environments and what makes them feel comfortable and uncomfortable. So many interviewees spoke about the following areas. So sounds came up a lot. So hearing, some of them said that they hear more than most. So they could literally hear the hum of the light switch, the same noise as the air conditioning, as the same as the conversation of 2 people in the hallway, or the hum of the fridge and a ping of a microwave. And one interviewer shared with us that the way to or from the train is actually the place where they feel more creative, because they really liked that frequency and that background noise. Others shared that they have to wear headphones and listen to loud rock music to channel their creativity. What was interesting is that when we were doing sort of a lot of the office designs and we were moving from offices to open plan, when we walked around with the project teams afterwards, they would often be upset that people sat there wearing headsets in the open plan, because the idea was for them to overhear what was going on and effectively learn more within the organisation. But as we heard, some people really do need to wear these sort of noise cancelling headsets. Acoustics came up a lot in discussions, and also we were reminded by people who think about sound absorption in corridors. Often that's not where we put any acoustics, and those spaces can be very noisy. Visual noise and colour contrast came up. So the idea of people being calmer around biophilic design, being able to look out the window, having colour and artwork, was also frequently mentioned and showed to me as part of our sort of interviews. Also, they mentioned signage, the size of signage, contrast, typeface. Lighting was mentioned, the idea of circadian lighting, being able to have lighting that replicates daylight or lighting that can be adjusted, avoiding those reflective surfaces that could often give headaches. I know that I have a preference for corridors as well, to be sort of broken up with windows so I can see outside, because when I feel a seizure coming on, I know it's best to restrict movement and to try and focus on the horizon. It also affects my balance. I'm like a sort of weeble going through corridors, and I'm really starting to appreciate curved corners. So going on from that, this idea of proprioception, spatial awareness and considerations, and this also includes hand-eye coordination and motor skills. I've recently had the front door changed in my house, and it has a thumb turn on the inside, and I can't even use the thumb turn myself. One interviewee with ADHD actually mentioned that they had to sit with their back to the wall, because otherwise they were distracted by movement from different directions around them. And others wanted designers to consider almost semi-private spaces off of social spaces so they could see what was going on, but not necessarily be affected by all the movement in the space. And when we're talking about movement, the balance sense is located in the inner ear, and that has an effect on orientation, coordination, and reflexes. It's like your body's navigation system. So anytime you are standing still, swinging, sitting, rocking, or moving your body through space in any way, your vestibular system is at work. I often remember even just at school, in the junior school, there was always that one person that would be sat on two legs of the chair and moving backwards and forwards. And the teacher would tell them to sit on four legs. And essentially, that movement was actually helping them work and helping them channel their energy and their creativity. So my sense of orientation has definitely been effective. I was the one that used to be able to read plans and orientate around space. Now my orientation is gone, and I think it was a combination of this and or signage that really made me want to go down this route of being an inclusive consultant. So I'd gone into an office like you do many times, like I have many times before, and I'd asked where the toilet or the washroom was, and they said to me, "Oh, it's deep in the core of the building as it normally is." So I orientated there. The signage showed me how to get there. And I turned around to come out, and there were three doors. There was no signage. I had no idea where to go, how to get back to reception, and I just thought I could have a seizure or a panic attack, and no one would find me. So I urge you, when you're thinking about signage, think about people's abilities. Including their ability to see, hear, feel, language barriers. And don't assume that people have a sense of direction, whether it's left or right, or north, south, east, or west. Sensory processing differences are different for signs as well. So I know that some people with dyslexia find all capitals difficult to read, and even if they're using sort of screen readers. Um, Look at color contrast. So the color ratio, I think that's best is 4.5 by 1, but I always say take a photo of design in sort of black and white. To see what it looks like, to see how easy it is to read. Provide notes, landmarks, and visual cues for clarity and familiarity. Another one that came up in the research was smell. So I heard extreme sensory feedback from smells. I hadn't really thought about it before, but some said, just colleagues wearing strong perfumes. And this one person went into the office and they interacted with this person with this perfume, and they found it so crippling they had to go home and stay in bed for the rest of the day. And I know now we use more cleaning and chemicals and scents, and we have to appreciate that these can cause headaches or stress or anxiety. Touch also came up, and I'm quite a touchy sort of feely person, and one of the interviewers mentioned that when they were in the office, someone actually just came up to them and touched them lightly on the shoulder and said, "How are you now? Get on." And again, that sent them off so much that they had to leave the office and go and lie in bed in the rest of the day. Others mentioned that they, often get their best ideas when twiddling a pencil, or some actually had their best creative ideas when they had their hand in a glove. And this could also relate to smell and familiarity. Others also mentioned how when they were at home or working in their home office, they felt more creative because they didn't have to put shoes on and go to work, so they could work sort of barefoot. Temperature again was another one that came up. So having been through the menopause, and sometimes I still feel like I'm going through it, I know that some environments that interviewers mentioned would have benefited me too. So having a thermometer in the space so they can monitor their optimal working temperature and moderate the space accordingly. So having fans or blankets, having access to focus rooms with soft seating or nap pods, and spaces where they had control over the temperature and sensory controls. There's a new inclusive workplace guidance in the British Standard 30416 for designers that we can share as well with resources. I mentioned about sort of chairs and height adjustable desks also came up. Neurodivergent interviewees mentioned that they felt more grounded by standing to work, but they didn't always want to be sort of standing. Others said that if they could give themselves a gift, it would be a running desk. Others said multiple screens or larger screens. so that they could reduce the risk of hyperfocus. And others also mentioned that they really missed not being in the office. So they decided to come back to the office because they missed the social cues. And that also affects their interoception, their sort of their mind and their balance and their well-being. So all liked the idea of a choice of settings. Some expressed a preference to have an anchored desk and were a bit nervous about non-assigned desking because they liked the idea of familiarity, visual cues and ideas. And they also had specific physical and neurological needs. And some also had very strict routines that they had to go through every morning. And adding another routine where they had to go into an office and set up their desk would just take away the time again when they could be creative. Often mentioned was a sensory or desensory space. So a sanctuary, a safe space, somewhere to retreat to. And some of the considerations they mentioned in this space were scents of plants, greenery, and lots of adjustable lighting, wireless or noise cancelling headphones, informal seating, different seats in there, calm, neutral light decors to reduce sensory overwhelm. Atmospherics and soundscaping. So some mentioned about rain or noise of thunderstorms, where they could actually compartmentalize from others using the same space. A temperature controlled space as well, and charging points to have the option to work in this area if they wanted to. Some talked about tactile environments and different textures, access to water, fidget toys. So most of you will be aware of the first building standard in the UK for sensory and neurological needs, PAS 6463, designed for the mind, neurodiversity and the built environment. This is a great resource which we'll share with everyone on the call around sensory processing and needs. And some of you also may have listened to my RIBA core CPD inclusive environments, and that really describes the 9 senses in more detail and talks about hypo and hypersensitivities. So again, we can send the link to that. The next slide, please. So everything we design is a journey for the users and designers. So how designers approach the design affects the design and thus affects the users in it. So we live in a built environment, architecture and design create, but we also exist in another environment that experiences, genes and psychology creates. And this second environment is another built environment that coexists. We continually add to this internal built environment as we perceive the world around us and different experiences, just as architects and designers add to the external built environment. And this in and out of mind model of built environments creates psychology and behaviors that are often not necessarily intended. So designers must understand this relationship, be aware of their own biases, as well as how their designs will reflect in their users. I think with this understanding, the design will have inherent checks and balances and will serve the user's needs in an optimal way. So this idea of design thinking creates the bias for inclusive design. So design thinking is about connecting ideas and methods from different areas of thinking with the goal of creating new models, new connections, new patterns, and new combinations. So I can also share Shalini's and my Indian colleague's HEAL project. When she did the project, she wanted to make sure that it didn't suffer from understanding the effects of these two environments on her. And so she developed an awareness of her own psychology and how that might affect the design process to mitigate or resolve any negative effects. So cones of experience that create cones of bias, that create cones of behaviors. So when designers implement a design element based on that cone of experience, for example, a male architect without neurodiversity will tend to design using his experience, not that of a female with neurodiversity. And this cone of bias can pervade the architect's thinking if not understood and mitigated. And we should be designing for the users and this idea of human-centric design. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk about inclusive design, universal design, accessibility, all terms that I'm sure you're familiar with. So universal design was a term coined by Ron Mace, a disabled architect and accessibility law expert in the United States in 1985. And through collaboration with a group of architects, product designers, engineers, and environmental design researchers, 7 key principles to universal design were established. And these are equitable in use, simple and intuitive to use, flexible in use, has the right perceptible information, has a low tolerance for error, requires low physical effort. You remember me talking about energy earlier, and has the size and space and approach for use. And this model moved away from the medical model and designing specifically for the disabled, and instead looked at designing products and environments to be useful by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialist design. Accessible design is slightly different. So accessibility is focused on ensuring that there are no barriers to serving someone through creating accommodations that solve a technical design, physical or cognitive barrier to engaging with a product, environment or service. So accessibility also includes testing the usability of products for different groups and implementing changes that help all users. This includes factors like the environment, behavior, context, and more. And accessibility sort of processes really include ongoing evaluation, user testing. I'm a big proponent of test and learn. We talk about degrees of wrongness rather than getting everything right. So it's really about testing, learning, understanding, and expanding the use of accessible products and services. When we talk about disability, we often firstly think about physical disability, but actually 90% of disabilities are invisible. 5% of the population have ADHD, 1 to 2% of the population is autistic, 10% of the population are dyslexic, 5% of the population are dyspraxic, 7% of the population have mental health needs, although I think this is probably higher since COVID. 5% of the population have acquired brain injury, and only 70% of the population have 20/20 vision, and that includes those that wear contact lenses or glasses. So inclusive design of that is a methodology that really enables and draws on a full range of human diversity. More importantly, this means including and learning from people with a range of perspectives. Human diversity covers both variation in culture, capabilities, needs and aspirations, protected characteristics, gender, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, disability, and often disability is the last one that's considered. I almost feel like if you consider that first, and particularly people with neurodiversity, you're actually covering a lot of the other characteristics. So the 5 principles of inclusive design are: inclusive design places people at the heart of the design process. It really acknowledges diversity and difference, offers choice where a single design solution cannot accommodate all users, provides for flexibility, and it provides buildings and environments that are convenient and enjoyable for everyone to use. So if we follow inclusive design, we should end up with environments that are inclusive so everyone can use them safely, easily, and with dignity. So when you registered, we asked you, have you ever consulted with individuals that are diagnosed or identified as neurodegenerative or neurodivergent as part of your project? And to some of you, these were new terms. And of those that said yes, 99% of you actually believed it added value. So please consider including a diverse range of people in the design process. And this doesn't have to be just from user groups within your clients. It can be charities out there. It can be groups like myself with Citizens with Experience. It can be reaching out to people on LinkedIn or looking at blogs or just understanding more around sort of inclusive design. And I would also say that for anyone interested in inclusive design, an understanding of the social model of disability as opposed to the medical model is key. So I'm just going to reiterate this for those that may not know. So in this particular model, the emphasis is not on attributing a cause to disability, but about us all having a variety of abilities, needs and aspirations, so that each one of us has the potential to bring something positive to the table and thereby remove barriers for collaboration and co-creation. So the medical model was a this person can't do this task because they have a medical condition. The social model flips this and says, this person can't do this task because the way society have built their surrounding environment. So doors are a good example. If the handle is too high, wheelchair users can't go through. But it's not because they can't use doors. If the doors were automatic, they could use them. We've simply constructed this world that simply doesn't work for them. So in the next slide from Systems with Experience, I'm going to talk about some of the barriers you may not have thought about, but that you see in your everyday sort of movement through environments and spaces. So next slide, please. Thank you for the thumbs up. Well done. So transitional and liminal barriers to entry and agency. So when you design or redesign a space, do you really pay attention to how people move through it? You know, I expect you to think about mobility aspects such as steps or ramps or entry systems. Do you consider the non-physical aspects of moving into, out of, and through and between spaces? Some spaces are designed as transitional with general elements such as a porch to protect people from weather, and with a door to keep out elements and control access. Some have specific elements such as a reception area with wayfinding, concierge, and security facilities. These transitional spaces often occur at the first point of entry to a building and when moving from the building to an outdoor space. In external spaces, the transition can be through hedges, gates, or between changes in flower borders. In internal spaces, they can be stairs, lifts, lobbies, where movement and circulation are allowed and controlled. Have you ever thought about the psychological effects of these transitions? I expect most architects and designers have used transitional spaces as control points and barriers. The very design can stop entry completely, even when warranted, permissible, and needed. So at Systems with Experience, we call this the liminal effect on psychology, where a boundary or portal or doorway creates an emotional reaction and action on the person using it. So here you can see some examples. So on the left, there is a door with just some small vision panels in it. It's a nice timber door. So it can be with or without security access, and it may or may not have a vision panel or a porthole, but invariably it needs the person to be close to the door to be able to see through it. So you have to go right up to it to see what's the other side. So the liminal effect on anyone wanting to gain entry, especially those who are first-time visitors, or with a condition that increases their anxiety, is one of nervousness and trepidation of using the door. It may cause a cognitive overload or underload where confusion sets in, either because there is too much stimulus or too little information. So the next picture shows a door with vision panels either side and a central vision panel. So this is an improvement because it helps to create this understanding of what might be behind the door, giving psychological perception of risk and the agency to enter. So there is better cognitive balance between the overload and the underload. And the final picture is actually a sliding door, automatic sliding door, and you can see glass in it actually has some curves in it as well. So the benefit of a sliding door is that it can be partially or completely open so that visitors perceive the agency to enter and that it's not this liminal barrier. The door has more sort of biophilic design elements with the shapes and textures, which also diminish that sort of barrier effect. So this type of access is free from security elements that increase the physical and psychological ability to enter, but can reduce the defensive and protection of people and things inside. Next slide, please. So other pictures you're probably all familiar with. So transitional liminal barriers to enter an agency, slide 2. So using fully glazed doors and partitions can really have a negative psychological effect and safety response due to the openness of the room, and that once inside that people can be seen. This effect can be further exasperated by the feeling of being trapped once inside with nowhere to hide or move in that space. So this glass door partition that divides a large space into 2 rooms reduces the negative effects The door itself is not immediately recognizable for the rest of the panel and can also cause confusion, especially if there are reflections as well in that space. And it could have an effect of people freezing outside of not knowing what to do. So if someone is in the state of anxiety, the normal responses are fight, flight, or freeze. None of which will be the outcome that I believe the designer wanted. And then finally, there is a picture, horrified by this one, but essentially this is a solicitor's office. It's you come through a glass door and there is a corner glass meeting room. Even I'm thinking about the solar gain, I'm thinking about acoustics, I'm thinking about the implications of lighting, biophilia. I wouldn't like to go into this space at all. I'd feel horrified in this space. So just thinking about these sort of liminal barriers to spaces that you're actually designing and how you can make them more inclusive. Next slide, please. So I can't do a talk about inclusive design without talking about toilets. Going to the toilet is a basic human function. We all do. It's also a good example of where you need to go beyond accessible design, and from the UK developments, it's almost part M, to make the space as accessible as possible for people of every ability. Go beyond code. So if you look at this toilet, and I'm thinking with my dad, or even as a carer, or my dad left or right-handed, think about the transfer side, whether the individual and or the carer has a preference for the left or right side. Where possible, try to allow space both sides of the toilet for transfer. Alternatively, where you're providing more than one accessible toilet, you can provide right and left-handed. Consider accessible toilets on each level. Think about the visually impaired and contrast and finishes and fixtures and fittings. Think about use. Again, just with the experience of my dad, individuals that may have colostomy bags have to empty the stoma or the colostomy bag in the toilet and then throw the bag away and change it. I often see pedal bins in these toilets that are difficult to use as they are being a pedal bin, but also in completely inaccessible locations. And I don't know if any of you have noticed, but the emergency push button is actually behind the toilet in the middle of the wall. And emergencies often arise when a person has fallen on the floor. And this could happen when a person is seated on the toilet or in a wheelchair. But this is why it's so important that the placement of the red button matters. It must be reachable from places a person might need it: the floor, the toilet, chair. Well, I've seen buttons put on above grab rails or by the back of the toilet in this case. I've seen large toilet roll holders that impede the use of grab rails. But it's also about training and awareness. As my husband pointed out when I showed him this particular slide, often when you have the emergency cord, cleaners go in to clean the space and they tie up the cord, make it completely unreachable, and don't take it down again. The other thing I've noticed, particularly with my grandson as well, and he doesn't have, he's just young with the noise sensitivity, but hand dryers, often people have noise sensitivities, and these accessible toilets just have noisy hand dryers, and I really recommend just providing an alternative. In this particular example, the seat is crooked, it's loose, there's no toilet seat to sit on. I really urge people to carry out user testing, and the picture on the right where you have steps that they've actually tried to put in ramps, still created a step up through the main door and then a narrow ramp to one side that doesn't allow a turning circle. If this was tested by someone in a wheelchair, they would see it won't work. So when you're designing buildings, ensure that users are trained as well. I think of my dad when we were accessing buildings in wheelchairs, and often we were standing outside the building because the door entry was actually operated by reception and reception was unmanned. Or you have the automatic controls in front of the door. So someone would have to wheel themselves up, push the automatic door and wheel themselves up quickly as the door opened out. So just seeing people struggle and then thinking about that energy use again. I love the term "nothing about us without us." My research is ongoing. I learn more every day, and you don't really know what anyone is experiencing unless you ask them about it. And this relates back as well to our own cones of bias and slide. So many times, accessibility strategies focus on getting people with disabilities into the space, and not out of a space. I recently audited a building with no refuge areas, and all the emergency exits actually led straight to staircases. So my association with groups like Systems with Experience and being able to observe and bring individuals with different minds, abilities and experiences for use testing gives a lot of value add. So to get sensory, physiological and psychological design elements, we really need to engage with people at the early stages. And I know that the Well Equity Building Standard also looks for community outreach and user testing and engagement. Inclusive design strategy needs to start with impacts and not outcomes. We need to change the original thinking to one of recognizing emotionals and the emotional drain that spaces and their usage demands on people. We need to consider how we can create diversity, agency, and dignity through inclusion. We could do several more insight series, as I'm sure, including the cost of inclusion. Inclusive design doesn't have to be expensive, especially if it's considered early enough. A designer gave an example recently of a sensory room where they designed this lovely textual wallpaper. They were being asked to value engineer it. They wanted to provide a sensory experience. And we just spoke about adding Lego or fidget toys instead. So offering variety and choice is also important. Next slide, please. As an interior architect, I often heard, well, you don't have any disabled users, or we don't have any disabled users. If an environment is inaccessible, disabled users can't and won't be using it. But if we do make our environments more inclusive, we open the door for different users. Even small improvements can have a high impact. Accessibility can be permanent, but it can also be temporary and situational. E.g., permanent, you could be born with one arm. Temporary, you could break your arm skiing, or situational, when you're holding a cup in one of your hands and trying to get through a door. So I'd encourage you to build it into the budget and program from the beginning, including user testing and community engagement. Inclusive, diverse, equitable and accessible design should not be a special case or nice to have. 1 in 6 people around the world experience disabilities and 1 in 7 are neurodiverse. Inclusive design is universally useful and beneficial for everyone. So by designing for the widest range of people, you design and benefit everybody. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to tell you a quick story before I come to the design canvas. This is lessons learned. So some of you may have heard of Matthew Slide through his book podcast, Sideways, or Book Rebel Ideas, and the idea that average fails everyone. But for those that haven't, I'm just going to tell the story. So jet planes, military aircraft technology evolved rapidly in the years after World War II. With the introduction of jet engines, planes became much more powerful and complicated. They also became alarmingly easier to crash. And on one particular day in February in 1950, 17 pilots crashed in one day. Post-crash analysis failed to find a mechanical reason for the crashes, and initially the Air Force blamed human error. The pilots knew their aircraft well. They'd never shown any signs of mistakes in sort of testing, and it just didn't hold up. So this led to a closer look at the design of cockpits in planes and the assumptions from which they were built. Back in 1926, engineers measured the body sizes of hundreds of pilots and combined them into a single average. And that average determined the ergonomics of everything in the cockpit, from the shape of the seat, to the distances, to the pedals and stick. And researchers wondered if their initial averages were off or if pilots had actually got bigger since 1926. So they set out to create a new, better average, and they measured 4,000 pilots on 140 different dimensions. And this included obvious things like height and weight, but they also recorded all the measurements that you'd expect a tailor to take, so chest circumference and inseam. They also measured small things like the distance from the pilot's eye to the ear. But one of the scientists, actually from Harvard, was really skeptical of this project because when he was at university, he had actually measured 250 fellow students and then compared each person to the average dimensions. And there were similar people, but the sizes of their hands were unique. None of the individuals' hands actually fit the size and the shape of the average hand. So the average was no better a match for an individual than just the measurements of a random person pulled off the street. So similarly, none of the 4,000 pilots were truly an average within all 10 dimensions. So they decided to try and narrow down the data and see how many pilots would fit into the average if they only used 3 dimensions, but it was still less than 3.5%. So the conclusion here is clear. A cockpit designed to fit the average would in reality fit nobody. A system meant to fit everyone or anyone, in fact, failed everyone. Planes were crashing because they were trying to fit pilots in. Planes needed to be adjustable, and this is why now we see the adjustable seats and mirrors we take for granted in cars today. So just think about the fact that don't design for the average. It might be a really nice illusion to think you've designed well, but think again about these sort of the outliers on the edges. Next slide, please. So this is a tool that we're going to share with you. It's an open source tool designed by the University of Cambridge. It's to help professionals consider a variety of user journeys, the diversity of human capabilities, and the need for different user needs and different capabilities and requirements, and then designing solutions. It was actually developed out of years of research, and the university looked at all the different guidances that have been out there across the world over several years, and they did a search and they found only 6 areas that actually could be useful in inclusive design. So that's why they decided to create this tool. So you can print this design canvas. You could also use it on tools like Mural and Miro, so digital tools. You start by describing the personas and then the journey, and then the physical, sensory, and cognitive capabilities. And if we go on to the next slide. So you're looking at the physical capabilities of individuals. Next slide. The sensory capabilities. Next slide. And the cognitive capabilities. So we're going to share this canvas with you and instructions how to use it. Next slide, please. So essentially you would start in the left-hand side describing the persona. So if I was filling it in, it would be, I'm 55, I have had stroke, I have this tumor, I have osteospondylosis. I would talk about my journey, possibly into London by train. I'd add the notes about going up the stairs. On physical capabilities, I get tired easily. Sensory capabilities, I mentioned about my vestibular sense and balance. And cognitive, I'm care as well for my mother, and sometimes I just need to decompress. And then I go on to describe my needs and requirements. And if anyone wants to reach out, I can share this canvas and I can share sort of 10 different completed examples. Next slide, please. So as a gift from us, we're going to give you the canvas you can use in your design. There are some ideas here about sort of reaching out. So if you want any information, and we're going to share some resources. And then next slide, please. So as a call to action, I would say for those of you that are neurodegenerative or neurodivergent, learn how you work, play, and live best and be kind to yourself. Learn how to communicate to others how you work, play, and live best as well. And for everyone, be patient with others. Be aware of your own unconscious bias. Champion an inclusive environment, and it's a great start coming to this seminar today, so thank you. Respect and listen. Really consider those sensory issues and map into the environment. Start to see through the lens of others, learn their language. We all present and process information differently. Think about consistency in approach and collaboration. Nothing about us without us. Test and learn, adjust if necessary. I will also share a follow-up with the Global Inclusion Awards 2024. If anyone wants to put in a inclusive design or a project or a client that they want to go forward to the award, so we'll put a link in for that as well. And I just want to add on a picture, a happy note. So next slide, please. So it's all about reframing the design. So you can see in the top here, so this is a MRI scanner, which I'm quite familiar with. But Doug Dietz, the principal designer with GE Healthcare, redesigned a pediatric MRI machine. It was clinical, it was state of art, and he was so proud. But his pride changed when he saw it being used. He realized that he focused on the wrong thing. He really didn't consider it through the eyes of the children using it. So he reframed it to solve by making specific accommodations. So instead of this scary hole, he decided to make it fun. He created an experience. It was great. When the children arrived, they were given admission tickets like a fun fair. It started with the game in the corridor. They painted stones that children would jump across. I know my grandson, who's 5, would love that. He'd probably imagine the floor as lava and jump across the stones to the machine. They put in loud noises, which were disguised as 3, 2, 1, take off. And literally after the scan, the children wanted to ride again. So the sedations that they have to give the children previously were reduced from 80% to as little as 3%, all because of this reframed experience. There were other measurable benefits too. So reduced costs, specialists who administer anesthetics weren't needed. Patient satisfaction went up to 90%, and more scans happened in a day, so no convincing was needed. Products, environments, and services aren't transactional. Think about the users and how it makes them feel physically, psychologically, and sensory. Think about pain points, abilities, the user journey, and how it makes people feel, and really be an inclusive designer. Thank you.